Hello and welcome to the Counting the Earth podcast from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm Alice Hope.
And I'm Sue Nelson. Throughout this podcast, we explore the environment and the natural world, but always through the lens of one number.
And today's number is 1,500. That's the number of insect pollinator species estimated to occur in the UK. And when we say pollinators, we're talking about bees, moths, butterflies, beetles, wasps, and flies. This episode marks the release of the latest report from the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, which is known as POMS, funded by both UKCEH and the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, the JNCC. And it's filled with useful information and important data that helps us to gain a picture of the trends for different pollinators over time.
So this means we are out and about in gardens and meadows, rain or shine. Dr Claire Carvell is a senior ecologist at UKCEH who leads UK POMS, and she's also an advisory steering group member for DEFRA's National Pollinator Strategy. So I met up with Claire one bright and sunny morning just outside her office in Oxfordshire. I'm at UKCEH in Wallingford, surrounded on three sides by buildings, and that hum you can hear in the background is relating to a system with their fume cupboards and their labs. But I'm actually in a meadow. Claire, has this beautiful wildflower meadow always been here? Because I don't seem to recall it last time I was here, but that was before the pandemic.
Yes, so if you had visited us a few years ago, you probably would have seen a fairly tightly mown patch of grass in this sort of 50-metre area that we're standing in now. But in fact, over the last few years, two colleagues of mine from the biodiversity team, Sarah and Lucy, have been painstakingly establishing and recreating this fabulous meadow vegetation.
I'm very impressed, and looking across it now, well, you've got lots of very beautiful big oxeye daisies, you've got buttercups, dandelions, the purple thistle shape of a knapweed there, and yellow rattle everywhere, and speedwell. I mean, good grief, have I missed some?
I think you've spotted most of the flowers, and it's a really great year for the yellow rattle this year. This is important because it's a hemiparasitic plant which will kill off some of the more aggressive grasses and make space for all the other flowers to come in. And the variety of flowers is what's really important to bring the pollinators in as well.
Speaking of pollinators, I've already seen a cinnabar moth, that lovely sort of orangey red and black colour of its wings. What sort of pollinators do you get in a small meadow like this?
Well, I thought you were going to ask me about numbers, Sue. So it's a difficult thing to estimate the number of pollinators in a given patch, because obviously that's going to relate to the types of flowers, their distribution, how many there are, and also the time of day and the weather on that particular day when you're surveying. But yesterday in the sunshine, I did a quick walk, slowly walking along and counting the insects that I saw in a 1 metre strip. And just in a 5-minute period, I saw 8 different insects from about 6 different insect groups. So there was a solitary bee, a honeybee, 2 bumblebees, beetles and a moth. If you multiplied that number up, you could estimate that you were seeing around 400 pollinators in this 50 by 50 patch at that snapshot in time.
If we walk over there, I can see a bumblebee.
Yeah, there are some bumblebee workers using the yellow rattle. This one here is Bombus hortorum, the garden bumblebee. It's one of the longest tongued species in the UK, and you can see there she's actively collecting pollen from the yellow rattle.
One of the ways in which you can count the pollinators is with an app called Fit Count. How does it work?
FIT stands for the Flower Insect Timed Count app. This is a survey that we have designed as part of the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, sometimes referred to as UK POMS. We're aiming overall to try and increase our understanding of the status and the abundance of pollinators across the UK. And the important thing about these surveys is that they are using the same repeated standard method over time to try and get a much more robust picture of numbers in different places and different times. The FIT count is a 10-minute count, and it simply involves placing a quadrat of 50 by 50 centimetres over a patch of flowers and observing the number of insects that visits those flowers over a 10-minute period. The important thing about fit counts is that you don't have to be an insect expert to do one. We ask people to simply record the insects to group level, for example, distinguishing between solitary bees, bumblebees and honeybees, then being able to recognise hoverflies, other flies. We put the beetles into a group, the butterflies and moths and the wasps and so on.
And there are images that help people do that, because it could be easy to mistake, say, a marmalade fly or a hoverfly, which have stripes. Can at first glance you might think they're wasps, but they're actually flies.
Indeed, that's right, Sue. So we provided some guidance to indicate some of the key features that differentiate the different groups of insects. With hoverflies, it's things like those really short feathery antennae and the big eyes, and also their behaviour. So you can see on the app there's an insect guide, and we also provide lots of guidance on the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme website as well.
Do you also take note of where people are in the UK? I'm just wondering whether people might all choose to sit in a wood with bluebells or maybe lean towards one particular type of flower.
No, that's a really great question, Sue, and it's important that we have a range of different places and habitats in which we can monitor pollinators. We know that some of them are very generous, they occur in lots of habitats, and we also know again that, the type of flower that you're observing is going to have a really big influence on the types of pollinators you see. So we ask the recorders to give us a little bit of information on the context in which they're doing their fit count. That includes the type of habitat you're in, a pinpointed location which the app helps you with, and then we ask a few questions about the number of flowers in your patch, how they're distributed, and we also ask a few questions at the end of the survey about the weather, so we can understand again if it was a very hot sunny day, there's a chance you would have seen a higher number of insects on average.
And what sort of information have you gleaned from these fit counts in terms of which pollinators do we see more often than others? I'm assuming you see certain pollinators on certain flowers.
Overall, the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme's been running since 2017, and we've received a fantastic 16,470 fit counts from a whole range of different habitats in different parts of the UK. You mentioned the different flowers, so we set a list of what we call target flowers. There are about 14 flowers on there that are quite common and widespread in the UK, where we're trying to get as much data as we can. But even across those flowers, there's a real contrast. So if we look at our sort of league table for the flower insect time count and the different flowers, we see actually ivy is at the top there.
I'm surprised by that.
Yeah, it's on average we see around 23 insects per 10-minute fit count visiting ivy. Ivy is a fabulous late summer flowering plant for a whole range of pollinators, and indeed it's really important for the wasps and the flies as well as the late
You're
flying
right,
bees.
because there's some flowering ivy on a little path, a sort of cut through near where I live, and it's always covered in hoverflies and wasps.
And actually the lovely thing about ivy is you can do your fit count against that vertical surface, so you don't have to be crouching down. And next on the list we've actually got hogweed, which is a very common plant of our farmland, field margins and hedgerows, that lovely sort of fluffy white open umbellifer. Again, that's another really important flower for flies. And we see lots of small insects on hogweed. So sometimes the small insects can bring the numbers up a little bit, but we think it's really important that we're encouraging people to record everything they see again, so they can really get their eye in for the different insect groups. If I come down the sort of league table, we've got lavender in there, about 14 insects per 10 minutes. You'll find particularly the bumblebees and the honeybees. We've got other really quite common and widespread flowers such as ragwort, hawthorn, white dead nettle, white clover, dandelion and buttercup. The great thing about the data we're getting from the fit counts is that we're able to really start studying what sorts of different insect communities are visiting these different flowers and how that's changing over time.
Is the picture a positive one? Because you often hear about that phrase insectageddon, and that we're losing species. Is your data showing that, or is it showing that actually we're not doing too badly, that the number of pollinators might even be increasing with certain species?
If we look at some of our previous work on modelling changes in species distribution across the UK, we know that a large number of species have been in decline. So from this modelling of the individual records of bees, we think around 26% of wild bee species and about 51% of hoverfly species have declined since 1980. But in fact, there are signs within those data sets that those declines may be starting to slow. We're seeing over the last 5 to 10 years slightly more levelling up in the sort of numbers of species that are declining and increasing. And indeed, when it comes to the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme data, it's important to note that this kind of 6-year time series is really probably too short to be able to detect trends with any sufficient confidence yet. Insect populations are notoriously variable between years, even when we're implementing a standardised survey, and there are many factors that can affect their numbers. But the early signs are that we seem to be seeing these sort of annual fluctuations and a fairly stable pattern in the overall numbers.
Do we know why? We've just had No Mow Main, and I've really noticed so many more people into it. And obviously that will, by allowing dandelions to grow in your lawns, for instance, that will cause more food for pollinators.
There's been a fantastic increase, I think, in not only the number of people that are interested in providing wildlife habitats in their gardens, but we have also had a significant effort across our agricultural areas with things like the stewardship schemes and the subsidy schemes for farmers. Again, our research is showing that by sowing strips of wildflowers alongside our crops or alongside our orchards, we can significantly boost the number of insects. So that there's an indication that some of those conservation schemes, stewardship schemes, and efforts in gardens and allotments may be helping to stabilise these declines, but really importantly, we need to keep monitoring them to understand how those patterns may fare over a longer time frame. We probably need at least 10 years before we can really be confident about getting trends from these monitoring schemes.
And that's where we get to the importance of your volunteers.
There's absolutely no way that we would be able to collect data on this sort of scale in any capacity with just using researchers or technicians.
Now, I've noticed that you've got 3 different coloured plastic bowls by your feet.
These are what we call pan traps, and within the pollinator monitoring scheme, the second survey that we're running is what we call a 1 kilometre square survey, and it's using these pan traps, which are bowls filled with soapy water and set at vegetation height, left out for 6 hours to sample the flying insects that are in a given area.
Now, you've got what looks like a wooden stake, sort of waist height, with 3 metal rings, obviously to pop each colour pan in. You've got a blue one, a green one, and what colour's the third? Is it white? Oh yes, I said green, but it's actually that fluorescent yellow, like a highlighter pen.
In fact, if you look around the meadow, you can see how that almost directly replicates the colour scheme demonstrated by the flowers that these pollinators are feeding on. So I'm just going to use a mallet to bang that wooden stake into the ground.
Oh, there's a ladybird there by the bottom of the stake.
Then I'm going to take the 3 pan trap bowls and position them in the wire holders, nice and level. And it's actually important that that set of bowls is set at the height of the vegetation, so it's sitting alongside the flowers in this particular piece of habitat. So we've got a wing nut here to get that unscrewed.
And you're going to lower it, yes.
I'm going to lower it because it's obviously been set for a taller sward. Okay, and then we're going to fill them with the soapy water.
And then you just wait.
It's a 6-hour period. During that time, we're not just going to the pub. We actually ask our surveyors to collect some more information about the habitats surrounding the pan traps, and also to record the weather conditions at the time of the pan trap survey. The POMS 1 kilometre survey occurs over 95 squares now across the UK, which is really fantastic coverage. After the 6 hours, we simply come along and effectively sieve the insects into a little piece of gauze. That gauze is then placed into a tube. The tube will contain 70% alcohol, so it keeps the insects preserved, and from a given site we'll have 5 of those tubes, 5 of these pan trap stations, coming back to the lab for us to find out what's in them.
What have you found in terms of the insects that they attract?
The pollinator monitoring scheme pan trap survey has been running again since 2017. That has included 1,420 days of survey visits, which again is a fantastic effort from mostly volunteers actually. In terms of what we found in the traps, you may be surprised they only actually attract between 3 to 4 bees and hoverflies per set of traps per 6-hour period. But then there's a whole host of other insects that these pan traps are sampling. One of our survey squares in Wales gave us 30 bee species sampled during the 4 surveys that were undertaken in 2022. And the nice thing we're able to do with the with the recorders and the volunteers who are collecting this information is we send them a report every year of all the species that their surveys have unveiled. So with the bees and the hoverflies that we actually identify to species level only making up maybe 5% of the trap, that other sort of 95% is made up of about 75% of other flies that are not in the hoverfly groups, like the house flies, dance flies, soldier flies, robber flies. Even just naming the different common names of the fly groups gives you an idea of the number of species that we could be talking about there. And we also see small numbers of wasps, beetles and butterflies and moths coming into the pan traps as well.
What's, I think, for me so striking about that is that the bumblebees get all the glory, and it almost feels like they get all the credit for pollination. But actually, what your research is finding, the less glamorous insects, the hoverflies, the flies, although I think hoverflies can be really beautiful, are really important, and especially the housefly, which, let's face it, most of us consider a bit of a nuisance.
That's right. Most of the flies do feed on liquids, which, include nectar from flowers. Not all of the fly families are flower visiting, but of those that are, a lot of them are quite hairy. So, that makes them really good at transferring pollen. But it's more to do with their numbers. They occur in large numbers and they're often jumping around between flowers. So, in fact, a recent studies found that about 84% of all the pollen carried by flies was actually by these non-hoverfly species. So the other flies that often referred to as the forgotten pollinators.
Now, the number that we've used for this podcast is 1,500, as in 1,500 species, but that sounds potentially an undercount.
I think it's probably fair to say that 1,500 is an underestimate of the number of pollinating species. Even if we just look at the larger moths, which of course many of which are active at night, there are several hundred species that are likely to be visiting flowers and potentially pollinating. So I would say that estimate's at least up in the 4,000 to 5,000, if not 6,000 species of pollinating insects in the UK, and we probably really only know a lot about maybe 20% of those. I remember great excitement in the lab when the taxonomists were looking at the hoverflies when they found the dark copper-black hoverfly, which is called Ferdinandia ruficornis. And actually this was a new square for Wales. We were extending the known range of the species quite a long way into mid-Wales from previous known records.
So are you getting surveys done in areas that you've not had done before in the past?
That's right. So typically recording of bee and hoverfly species across the UK is done by these fabulous groups of amateur naturalists who form the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society or the Hoverfly Recording Scheme. And indeed at UKCEH we've used a lot of their data to understand more about the change in status of species. But that's all based on single records of individual observations where we can't always control where someone chooses to go or how they choose to record the insects. With the POMS survey, it's using this standardised method at a fixed set of sites, and as I said, many of those sites are in locations where no insect surveys have previously been conducted. So we're trying to get a really good overall picture of the environment of the countryside in the different areas of the UK, including in Northern Ireland as well, and see how that might be changing over time.
Dr Claire Carvell on pan traps, which are used for 4 surveys a year, and the Fit Count app, which I've now downloaded onto my phone. The season started on the 1st of April and doesn't finish until the end of September, so there's plenty of time left to take part. And we'll return to Claire briefly at the end of the podcast to talk about some of the challenges ahead.
Listening to her speaking to you, it was really clear how important volunteers are in providing the pollinator data. The UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme is a really great example of a partnership of conservation and research organisations working together with government to provide a stronger evidence base for the status of our pollinators. Its partners include Butterfly Conservation, the British Trust for Ornithology, the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and BugLife, along with Hymettus, the Natural History Museum, and the universities of Reading and Leeds. So it really is a partnership programme.
Exactly. Now, many gardeners listening will be aware of how they can help pollinators and support biodiversity, no matter how big or small the space. And UKCEH has also partnered with the Royal Horticultural Society at RHS Wisley to extend the fit count to their gardens.
Now, you mentioned that we were looking at pollinators rain or shine earlier on. You got the sun shining when you came to visit
I
UKCEH.
did indeed.
But when we went to RHS Wisley near Woking in Surrey to meet Senior Wildlife Specialist Helen Bostock, we had a wonderful time, don't get me wrong, but we definitely got the rain.
This is catmint or Nepeta, and it just kind of doesn't know when to stop flowering in the summer. Things in this family, if you think of the salvias and things like sage, and if you even allow culinary sage to flower, you're going to have actually quite a feast for bees, because that spiking flower that you get on catmint is just very, very attractive to some of the longer tongued ones. So here we've come to one of our beds in the wildlife garden. There's not very much space between the plants. They look random, but that is a deliberate choice here to allow them to self-seed. Do you see all the lovely feathery bronze fennel coming through? When that comes up and flowers, that'll be really attractive to some of the very small pollinators. At this time of year, the euphorbias are going strong, and they are actually quite a handy plant. I get a lot of the little solitary wasps on there in my garden.
Quite a few of these to me look like things that people might ordinarily think of as weeds.
Yeah, same with ragged robin, and that pink, slightly spiky flower.
I think I've got to the stage in my gardening career that I'm starting to break down that sort of distinction between is this a wildflower or is this not. In a garden setting, these just blend together so perfectly. They're each bringing something slightly differently. The curation of this is almost done more on what are they doing, what's their purpose, what was their function, and what are they delivering, and visually as well. But yeah, you're right, we're throwing it all in together, and it kind of, well, I don't know what you think, but I think it looks right.
We are up by the brand new science building, and we're next to the health and wellbeing garden and the new wildlife garden, and we're at the top of the hill, and we've got a beautiful view over the garden. I mean, there's just so many plants. Could you give us an idea of the sort of range and number of plants that you have at RHS Wisley, Helen?
Well, we're a bit spoiled here. We've got about 30,000 taxa of plants at the garden. In terms of actual physical number of plants, the short answer is we don't know. We're probably talking into the hundreds of thousands of plants.
I noticed as we were walking here through the gardens, and we got the gorgeous smell of roses on the way when we passed a whole patch of roses, was that you had an area of grass which I would not normally associate with a garden, and particularly not the RHS, that was left for wildflowers.
Yes, I think if people come to our gardens, they might be pleasantly surprised at just how varied our landscapes are. This isn't one lawn for everyone. We've got lots of different grassed areas. So yes, we do have some formal, beautifully striped lawn panels on either side of our water lily canal. But then, yeah, we're taking other areas into summer long grass. Just on the patch beyond where we stood now, it's absolutely full of yellow rattle, and that's interspersed with ornamental alliums. So that yellow and purple, it's really attractive.
Now, your job as the Senior Wildlife Specialist involves developing better ways to monitor biodiversity in the garden. So how do you go about doing that?
I think of it almost like a tiered system. So we have a number of formal surveys which are done by ecological specialists. That might involve things like invertebrate surveys and aquatic surveys of some of our ponds. But we do also have quite a lot of in-house knowledge and increasing amounts of expertise among our staff and volunteers. So another sort of tier is the monitoring schemes that are done around the country. So for example, I head up a bee walk which monitors the bumblebees once a month between March and October. We also run the butterfly monitoring scheme. We have bird walks. We do bat monitoring. We put out reptile mats. So, the list just goes on. But it's all helping us to build up a bit of a baseline, really, so that we can then use that to come back to in future years to see whether some of the enhancements and changes of management have really started to take effect. Some things we're lucky in that, for example, we have one of the earliest, longest running Rothamsted light traps for moths. So that's going back best part of 50 years, and that will, we'll be able to use that to really sort of look at that longer trend.
So you mentioned there a few of the different monitoring schemes that are going on at RHS Wisley. And at UKCEH, we have something called the Fit Count app, which is for pollinator monitoring. How does that app contribute to your work?
We're a big fan of the Fit Count app. You didn't pay me to say that. We've been aware of the potential use of the Fit Count monitoring technique tool for a while, but haven't quite worked out how we would be able to incorporate that into our monitoring scheme until last year, when we came on board as one of the projects. So we have something called the RHS Plants for Pollinator Counts project, and I set up a pilot at 2 of our RHS gardens, here at Wisley in Surrey and also at our garden at Hyde Hall in Essex. We had 16 volunteers across those 2 gardens, and they absolutely loved it. I ran a training day at each of the sites, and then they really were trying out some of the techniques. So were they able to use the Fit Count app on their phones? Were they able to find the plants that we wanted them to go out and gather data? And the RHS has something called the Plants for Pollinator scheme or lists. Those have been available to gardeners to help sort of direct them to some of the better pollinator-friendly plants that they can buy and grow in their gardens.
Such as what?
Well, lavender. Okay, it's a very long list. It's got wildflowers, things like foxgloves, but yes, it's also got a lot of ornamental plants that people will be familiar with growing, things like single-flowered roses, and dahlias going on to the end again. We exclude double forms, things that might restrict access to pollinators, but it's really a very popular scheme. The garden plant list has probably around about 500 or so plants listed on there, but we're always looking for ways to improve our evidence base for those plants. And the use of the Fit Count app, we know it was standardised. We know that it's something that you don't have to be an absolute, expert.
Tech genius.
Genius, yes, exactly. But also you don't have to be an entomologist, and I think it's accessibility that really drew us to it. We'd run a couple of pollinator days at our gardens and knew there was some appetite amongst gardeners for collecting data on plants that they're growing in the garden. So we thought, let's spin that and use that to actually help inform our list. Even just the pilot went super well. All 16 of the volunteers wanted to keep going this year, so it's not been the best of starts to the spring.
It is fairly chilly. We are under cover, fortunately. The rain has eased off slightly, but on the way here it was quite wet, and it's been like that the whole spring, really, hasn't it?
It's not been easy, so I wondered whether some of our volunteers might lose a bit of momentum, but they're so excited when they actually get a good sunny day. If on the day that they are normally volunteering for us, the conditions are right for doing a Fit Count, then they will go and do it. So yeah, on the days that have, everything's aligned, they've been so excited and messaging me saying, oh, the bees were out, or, the flies were out, whatever it was. So it's been really nice to, sort of progress that. And later this year, through the summer, I'm going to be aiming to roll that out across our other 3 gardens. One of the volunteers said that she now can't actually walk past a flower without stopping and having a good nose to see what's in it.
Our number for this episode is 1,500, which is the estimate for the number of pollinator species in the UK. And that really highlights why it's so important to appeal to all pollinators, not just bees and butterflies, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's something that we really try to get the message out when we're working with gardeners. And the pollinator list that we have, we're not saying specifically which pollinating insect it is that you might be attracting, because we've tried to give a real breadth. So that might be some of the long tubular flowers, things like honeysuckle, which might bring in these sort of day-flying moths, your evening, night moths as well, but also some of the longer-tongued bees. It might be, something like sort of echinaceas, the flat, more Asteraceae type flowers, which are going to be much more accessible to shorter tongue things, your hoverfly groups. But let's not forget, we've got things like flower beetles that go in there. So yeah, I think the message is, one, realise that we've got so many more things than just bees, that we really do have this wonderful variety. And that's what gives resilience in our pollinator services as well. But also realising that if you're going to support those, you need to have a similar variety of flowers in your garden. You can't just get away with a whole border of double flower roses, that you do need to really think about seasonality. Have you got something flowering in most months of the year? Have you also got different flower shapes that might appeal to different insects as well? Even just the plants itself, I mean, let's not forget something like leafcutter bees might need the actual leaf part of the plant, and woolcarder bees might need, the plant hairs to line their nest with. But it's also about creating nest sites that could be a bit of patchy lawn. I mean, here's the RHS actually giving you the go-ahead to not look after your lawn quite as well as your neighbours might think you should. Because on some of the short grass and the sparser grass, you're more likely to get some of the ground nesting mining bees. Or, you might have a bit of a base of a hedge. Allow some of the foliage to grow up around that and some of the leaf litter to remain, because who knows, that could well be a bumblebee, des res areas. We touched on, obviously, the moths and butterflies, the Lepidoptera. But of course, unlike bees, they rely on a herbivorous stage where they're actually eating the plant foliage. And so the larval food plants, there are some really good lists out there to be looking for. And if you're going to plant for larval food plant, it's probably good to put a fairly good number, a cluster of plants, rather than just a dot one in here and there as a bit of a nominal thing, because if you need to be able to appeal and support the life cycle.
Helen Bostock at RHS Wisley on the success of the Fit Count app with their volunteers. Incidentally, these volunteers rated their confidence when it came to identifying pollinating insects before and after using the app. And their confidence went up from an average of 2.46 out of 5 to 3.92. So people are really learning from this app as well.
And there was also some great advice for gardeners from Helen there about planting and gardening for the life cycle of an insect and how even leaf litter can be important.
I thought her point about avoiding double flowering plants was really interesting
Hmm.
too. These are plants which have a really aesthetically pleasing mutation where the stamens, the long thin sections with the pollen, are converted to extra petals. But it's the stamens which provide the pollen, so no stamens means no pollen for the pollinators. Also, as we've heard, creating multiple habitats in your garden with a range of plants will really help pollinating insects, especially as climate change is affecting the start and the length of flowering seasons.
And that's the perfect point to return to Claire Carvell at the UKCEH wildflower meadow, as the effect of climate change is something we discussed among the challenges ahead for insects.
It's likely that a warming climate and the types of changes we're seeing in our weather are going to have both positive and negative effects on insects. There's evidence globally, for example, that bumblebees are changing their ranges in response to increases in temperatures. There are species that are moving north in their range because the southern margins of their ranges might be becoming too warm. But it's also important that we think about some of the other habitat requirements of these insects, like you mentioned, wetter periods. For example, the flies spend a large part of their life cycle in moist, boggy or wet places. And we found actually with the pollinator monitoring scheme data, there was a bit of a signal that the 2022 drought, the very hot, dry weather we had in 2022 in the UK, in particular in England, may have indeed lowered numbers of the hoverflies because it simply became too hot and dry for them to survive. So there are various different challenges. The important thing with climate change is that we're still providing the habitats and the places for those insects to live and move and adapt to their changing environment.
UKCEH's Dr Claire Carvell. It's really good to hear that nuance. As always, when it comes to data and numbers, the true story is much more complex than some of the headlines would have you believe. But also hearing how volunteers are key to helping us understand what is going on in our environment across the UK, and especially for the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. The first week of June celebrates National Volunteers Week, and the end of the month is National Insect Week. So it's a perfect combination and a perfect time for this podcast.
By the way, the Fit Count app is international and available in 9 different countries. So if you want to download it for counts here in the UK, remember to select UK as the country when you're setting up. And I was especially struck by the simplicity and ease of using both the app and the pan traps. But I'm assuming, Alice, that since there are science labs both at UKCEH and RHS Wisley, because we were standing outside one in the rain, there are other methods of assessing pollinators and their food sources.
Yes, there are several new methods coming through, including molecular techniques such as DNA barcoding, which sequences small elements of DNA from the sampled insects and can identify specific plants from the DNA in the pollens that they've been feeding on. This has real potential to expand the range of insect groups that monitoring schemes like POMS will be able to cover in the future.
And that's another big take home message from today. It's definitely not all about the bees. Flies and indeed moths play a big and important role in pollinating plants.
We can't forget about the beetles either.
The beetles, too.
And that really shows that our official number of pollinating species in the UK at 1,500 is happily likely to be an underestimate.
Which is fabulous. Do join us next time on Counting the Earth when we take another look at nature and numbers. Thanks for listening.